Welcome back to A Wicked Historian.
You are a young church official in Rome, walking through the silent marble halls of the Apostolic Palace. It's the summer of 1503, and the air is heavy thick with incense, candle smoke, and something else, something unsettling. The Vatican should be quiet at this hour, but it isn't. Faint music echoes down the corridors, then laughter, then voices careless, indulgent, completely out of place. You stop outside a set of elaborately carved doors. Saints and angels stare down from the wood, frozen in judgment. Your hand hovers near the handle. For a moment, you consider turning back. But curiosity, and a sense of duty, pushes you forward. You open the door and whatever faith you carried with you fractures instantly. Inside, Pope Alexander VI reclines on silk cushions, gold goblets overflow with wine. Courtiers linger, their postures too comfortable, their gazes too familiar. The atmosphere isn't spiritual. It's relaxed, indulgent, and disturbingly secular, like a royal court that has forgotten its purpose. This is not a house of prayer. This is power without restraint. Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, was not the first pope to enjoy luxury. But what set him apart was how openly he erased the boundary between sacred duty and personal desire. There was no secrecy, no apology, no fear of consequence, and the deeper truth, whispered even among hardened diplomats, was more troubling still. The Pope's household functioned less like a religious institution and more like a private empire, built on loyalty, pleasure, and absolute control. This wasn't just corruption, it was a complete transformation. Rodrigo Borgia didn't inherit a broken system, he perfected it. To understand how this happened, we have to step back into Renaissance Italy, a world where faith and politics were one and the same. The Catholic Church wasn't just a spiritual authority. It was a global superpower. It competed openly with kings, generals, and empires. The papacy controlled armies, vast lands, and immense wealth, and like any throne with that much power, it attracted men who wanted control far more than they wanted redemption. Rodrigo understood this from a young age. Born near Valencia in 1431, he rose through the church not through devotion, but through pure strategy. He was intelligent, charismatic, and completely flexible when it came to morality. Connections opened doors for him. Ambition kicked them down. By his mid-20s, he was a cardinal. By 30, he was one of the most influential figures in Rome. And all along, he ignored the rules. While others pretended to follow tradition, Rodrigo refused to pretend at all. He openly acknowledged relationships that others kept hidden. He openly supported his children, using his position to elevate his family's power. And no one stopped him, because in the complex web of Roman politics, no one could afford to. When he finally secured the papacy in 1492 through political deals and incentives that shocked even the cynical standards of the Renaissance, he didn't change. He escalated. The Vatican didn't slowly decay under Alexander VI. It shifted overnight. Papal residences were redesigned into luxurious apartments. Private chambers were expanded. Trusted insiders were rewarded not for their piety, but for their unwavering loyalty, and Rome began to whisper. Foreign envoys sent coded reports back to their kings, describing a papal court unlike anything they had ever seen. A court that was extravagant, indulgent, and completely unconcerned with appearances. The line between a spiritual leader and a secular king had vanished, but the most disturbing part of Alexander's reign wasn't the luxury or the parties. It was the culture he created, a system where advancement required silence, where holding on to power demanded participation in his schemes, and where faith, for those in his inner circle, became entirely optional. This was only the beginning. Once Alexander VI had secured his absolute control over the Vatican, he would begin pulling others into his orbit, family members, allies, and even his enemies, binding them to his rule in ways that would echo across Europe for centuries. Now, we'll step inside the inner circle of Pope Alexander VI, where loyalty was the only currency that mattered, conscience was a liability, and the Vatican itself became a stage for one man's unchecked ambition. Welcome to the world of the Borgias. Once Alexander VI secured the papal throne, the old rules simply stopped applying, at least, not to him. The Vatican transformed, becoming a closed world where loyalty mattered far more than morality. Advancement no longer depended on theological scholarship or genuine faith, but on how useful you were to the new regime. The cardinals learned this lesson quickly. To survive, you had to align yourself with power. At the very center of this new system stood Alexander's family. He didn't just favor them. He fundamentally embedded them into the machinery of the church. His own children, some still teenagers, were elevated to positions of immense authority, roles normally reserved for seasoned statesmen and respected clergy. The papal household began to operate less like a spiritual center and more like a royal court, complete with strategic political marriages, territorial deals, and complex alliances. To outsiders, it looked like blatant dynasty building. But to those on the inside, it felt like a heavy, unspoken obligation. Refusal was never really an option. Those who hesitated, who showed even a hint of reluctance, found themselves sidelined, their influence quietly stripped away. Those who actively resisted, they disappeared from the corridors of power altogether. The Vatican became a place where silence was generously rewarded, and having a long memory was a dangerous liability. Daily life inside the papal court reflected this dramatic transformation. Mornings that were once reserved for quiet prayer and spiritual reflection became packed with administrative routines and political meetings. Afternoons brought lavish banquets, theatrical performances, and intense negotiations conducted under the soft glow of candle light. Diplomacy and indulgence became indistinguishable. The sacred space of the Vatican blurred into a stage for spectacle and power plays. What truly shocked observers wasn't the excess itself. Renaissance Europe was no stranger to extravagance. It was how openly and shamelessly everything happened. Foreign ambassadors, sending reports back to their own courts, wrote encoded letters, detailing their discomfort and disbelief. Even hardened political figures, men accustomed to the brutal realities of power, privately expressed their unease. The papacy, it seemed, had stopped even pretending to be a beacon of moral restraint. But the deeper, more lasting damage wasn't visible in the gold leaf or the grand architecture. It was psychological. Imagine being a church official who had dedicated your entire life to faith, only to find yourself trapped in a system that demanded constant compromise. Many couldn't bear it. Some fled Rome entirely, choosing a life of obscurity over participation in the charade. Others stayed, learning to compartmentalize their lives. They treated their personal belief as a private matter, separate from their public duty, which had become purely transactional. They did what they had to do to get by. The most vulnerable, however, were those drawn into this world by promises of opportunity and advancement. Young courtiers, ambitious attendants, and aspiring associates arrived in Rome seeking protection and a chance to make their name. Instead, many discovered that proximity to power came with a terrible price, with expectations they had never, and would never, agree to. Once you were inside the Vatican's walls, escape became incredibly complicated. Alexander's court was built on a foundation of dependence. He provided status, he provided security, and he provided immense wealth. In return, he demanded one thing: absolute, unquestioning loyalty. And this rule applied to everyone, even his own family. His children were not exempt. Their value was measured solely by how effectively they served his broader strategy. For Alexander, affection and authority were one and the same. To love him was to obey him. This suffocating environment produced a chilling new reality. Corruption no longer felt like a rebellion against the system. It simply felt normal. It was just the way things were done. By the early 1500s, the Vatican's reputation had spread like wildfire across Europe. Stories circulated in universities, in royal courts, and in quiet monasteries. Some of these tales were exaggerated, fueled by rumor and political agendas. But many were not, and in the end, perception was powerful enough. Critics of the Church seized upon these accounts as definitive proof that its spiritual authority had completely collapsed under the weight of its own political ambition. Trust in the papacy eroded, respect for the institution faded. And through it all, Alexander seemed utterly unconcerned, because in his world, power was its own protection. As long as his alliance in it is held firm, as long as his armies obeyed his commands, and as long as wealth continued to flow into his coffers, the consequences of his actions felt distant, almost theoretical. But systems built on silence and fear are inherently unstable. They always, eventually, crack. And by the end of his reign, the first fractures in Alexander's world were already beginning to show. The very foundations of the power he had so carefully constructed were starting to crumble. Next time, we'll explore that collapse. We'll look at how Alexander's reign finally ended, the chaotic legacy he left behind, and why the shockwaves from his time as Pope still shape how we question power, authority, and institutions even today. When Pope Alexander VI died in 1503, Europe didn't exactly break out in universal mourning. For many, the news was met with a sigh of relief. His death marked the abrupt end of one of the most controversial reigns in the entire history of the papacy, and it exposed the sheer scale of the damage left in his wake. The financial records told a stark story. The papal treasury was nearly empty. The intricate web of political alliances he had so carefully woven began to unravel almost immediately. But perhaps the most profound damage was to public trust. The Vatican, which had long presented itself as an uncheckable moral authority, now stood exposed as deeply human and deeply flawed. The immediate aftermath was pure chaos. In the Papal States, local populations, long crushed under heavy taxation and tight control, started to push back. Inside the Vatican, church officials scrambled to distance themselves from the previous regime. It was a frantic race to erase the past. Records that were too incriminating quietly disappeared into the deepest archives. Official histories were rewritten, the language softened, and inconvenient events were reframed to emphasize political achievements over moral collapse. But memory is a stubborn thing. It's much harder to erase than ink on a page. Within a decade of Alexander's death, whispers of criticism against church corruption erupted into a full-scale rebellion. Reformers like Martin Luther pointed directly to the excesses of Alexander's era as undeniable proof that the entire institution had lost its way. Arguments that were once confined to hushed conversations in dark corners became bold public declarations shouted from the rooftops. Now, to be clear, the Protestant Reformation didn't begin solely because of Alexander VI. The seeds of discontent had been sown long before he ever sat on the papal throne. But his reign acted as a powerful fertilizer. He became a symbol, a poster child for everything that was wrong. He wasn't just a symbol of personal failure, but of institutional vulnerability. His story was a terrifying demonstration of what happens when unchecked authority meets ambition without a shred of accountability. Even centuries later, the echoes of his reign can be found in the very stones of the Vatican. Restoration work inside its ancient buildings has uncovered unsettling details: sealed-off chambers, mysteriously altered corridors, and decorative choices that directly contradict the official narratives written later. It turns out that architecture has its own memory, one that sometimes remembers what documents were forced to forget. The true legacy of Alexander VI and preserved in grand monuments or official doctrines. It survives as a stark and powerful warning. His reign is a history lesson on how quickly norms can collapse when power is concentrated without any oversight. It shows how easily loyalty can replace ethics, and how institutions will often choose to protect themselves by rewriting history instead of confronting their own failures. And, most tragically, it shows how it's the ordinary people, the staff, the families, the believers who ultimately bear the cost of this corruption. Imagine a young official walking through those marble halls back then, a person of conscience frozen between obedience to his powerful superiors and the truth he knew in his heart. His dilemma represents more than just a single moment in time. He represents anyone, in any era, who has witnessed the betrayal of a system they once trusted. That fundamental tension, the clash between authority and truth, is confined to the dusty pages of history. It repeats itself over and over, wherever power exists without challenge. Alexander VI undoubtedly believed he would be remembered as a master of politics, a builder of a grand legacy, a ruler who could bend the world to his will. Instead, he became something else entirely. He became a cautionary tale, a case study in how absolute power can warp and reshape institutions, and just how long the consequences of that can last. The Vatican endured, the faith of millions endured, but neither emerged from that era unchanged. They carried scars, and perhaps that is the final, most important lesson of his story. Institutions can survive corruption, but they never do so without being marked by it. If this journey into history's hidden corridors made you question how power really works, there are so many more stories waiting to be told. These are the stories that were buried not because they were forgotten, but because they were too uncomfortable for people to remember. Subscribe to A Wicked Historian and hit that bell icon for more videos just like this one. Let me know in the comments what other dark corners of history you want to explore next. Thanks for watching.